In our last lecture, we looked at global civil society. In this lecture, we turn more to the domestic realm and look at how civil society and the nation state interact with each other. NGO-like entities have been around since the middle of the 19th century. Early precursors included welfare associations, charities, and missions during the colonial period. Some of the earliest transnational non-governmental entities were movements to abolish the slave trade. The term itself, however, was not really used until the 1940s with the foundation of the United Nations. Since then, the number of NGOs have continued to rise dramatically. We have estimates over 50,000 NGOs operating in the South. And depending on how we view whether or not it's a community association or transnational association or a sort of a voluntary association, in India alone, using these kinds of loose definitions, there are 3 million NGOs. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, what accounts for the rise of NGOs? There are a few reasons for this. The first really is the decline of trade unions in many parts of the world. What we see here is that CSOs, or non-governmental organizations, have really filled the space in which trade unions have used for empowering workers and the like. We can also see there's been a failure of traditional political parties to address the needs of the poorest of the poor. Another sort of explanation behind the rise of CSOs is the damages wrought by structural adjustment programs or changing strategies of donors, which have meant that governments have proven increasingly incapable of providing social and economic goods. Effectively, what we can suggest is where the state is retreated, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations have gone into that space in which the state is retreated. Now, due to their alleged distance from the greed that characterizes the market and the political angling that characterizes the state, CSOs are often conceived as inherently good. The next question to ask is, what is the role of the state in civil society, if any? As we have seen in our last lecture, with most civil society theories, there's this underlying sort of assumption there's a separation between the state and society. Namely, civil society is meant to be a watchdog, monitoring the actions of the state. However, in nations such as China and Vietnam, this is not necessarily the case. The state is intimately involved in the development of civil society and the organizations within it in the context of China and Vietnam. The fear of instability or the threat to the party or the state legitimacy is carefully monitored in these jurisdictions. While these NGOs are undertaking important social tasks, our expectation that they become agents of political change may be wrongly placed. Many of the NGOs in these two jurisdictions are not seeking to become civic power against the state. Rather, they desire to complement the state. In understanding self-society in China, for example, it is essentially an understanding of state-society relationships. It would seem that the involvement and role of the local state adds a different dimensions of state-society relationships, leading to various types of relationships depending on the social organization in question and the level of state involved. For example, with a close relationship between state and civil society, the organizations become almost embedded within the state. So we can say through the passage of time, they obtain their legitimacy because they are intimately connected with the state. With the state being so intimately involved in civil society, for many scholars there's doubts whether or not this really denotes civil society, whether or not there's actually a civil society that exists. But it does tell us something. It tells us there's an analytical issue at hand here. Because on the one hand, we cannot discount the idea that civil society does exist in the context of China. But we also can't discount the fact that the Chinese state dominance creates doubt about the possibility of a free and independent civil society. Now, in our next lecture, we'll talk more about NGO relationships with the government. But as preview, we can argue that there is a rising number of NGOs relying on government sponsorship to scale up their activities. The government is seen as an enabling factor for the work of these NGOs. For many, this reliance is seen as a step backward from the creation of an independent and autonomous civil society for two reasons. First, the autonomy and independence of these organizations are eroded when they rely upon government finances and favors. Second, there is this fear that these organizations may become handmaidens of the state, or the sort of possibility of them becoming no more than aid to the public sector. So we see a burgeoning sort of body of literature emerging to question the existence or search for civil society. Nevertheless, are we seeking to find an exact replica of what we have in Western societies? A civil society that's relatively autonomous in a critical realm of the state? We cannot discount the idea that some NGOs are created and maintained by governments, or are staffed by former members of governments that maintain close ties with them. We'll look at this concept of gongos, for instance. There are potentially three generations of CSOs. Those committed to relief and welfare services, those engaged in small-scale community development projects, and those interested in social mobilization and conscious raising. Each generation of CSO has a different relationship with the state. Across many disciplines, there's a growing recognition that over the past 3 decades or so, NGOs have increasingly been providing social services and welfare services that were formerly under the control of the public sector in many nations. There is, however, a serious disagreement about what this actually means. Is this shift necessarily productive? What might it eclipse or obscure? Liberals generally see NGOs as a third sector, remedying the institutional weaknesses of both the state and private sector in promoting social and economic development. Neoliberals, meanwhile, see NGOs as part of the private sector, of socioeconomic significance, mainly delivering services to the poor cheaply, equitably, and efficiently. To intellectuals and activists on the left, however, NGOs carry hopes of a new politics that eschews the capture of state power and the centralizing tendencies of the Marxist-Leninist sort of movements in which many NGOs were born, but which really retain the commitment to a structural transformation of society. NGOs can be seen as agents of progressive social change that mobilize the underprivileged to resist privatization, to transform unjust social structures, and to advance a range of rights agendas. They are sometimes seen to be more effective than states at delivering promised goods to local communities, more participatory, more responsive to immediate local needs. They are seen as a social service provider. In fact, the majority of NGOs are engaged in social and welfare provisions. They are a social service provider that essentially facilitates the ongoing privatization of the public sector. And they're filling the gaps left by the retreating, structurally adjusted state and failing to challenge in deep structural terms unjust power structures. They are those, when we see NGOs, there are those who are essentially engaged in class conflicts over the distribution of resources as amenable to technical solutions. NGOs might dampen the potentially revolutionary energies that might lead to alternative development paradigms. It is important to pay attention to the institutional and organizational structures of NGOs. Most notably, we need to look at their issues with accountability, transparency, legitimacy, representativeness. These are themes we'll talk a bit more in our future lectures. As with all civil society organizations, they are embedded in a fluid web of relationships. That is, their connections are not just to their own governments or to the private sector, but to international lending organizations, bilateral aid agencies, the political prerogatives of donor states. Many studies that look at NGOs and state-society relationships within the state-CSO relationship still do not include systemic analysis of power relationships, transnationally, within the broader society, and within NGOs themselves. And this is something that we're missing, because a systemic sort of analysis of power relationships would show the kind of collaboration or conflicts that exist between governments and NGOs. Many NGOs remain elite organizations with close ties to the state and often have limited reach in mobilizing poor rural communities. Funding for these NGOs may therefore actually undermine the building of a representative and participatory civil society. When we look at the data on the relationship between NGOs and democratization, it's actually quite mixed. In most places, they have been lauded primarily for being effective agents of economic transformation, enforcing debt repayment, for example, or encouraging entrepreneurial initiatives. In other places, they've played an important role in the transition to democracy. So think of Chile, the Philippines, Argentina. But they've played a less significant role in post-transition. Worldwide, NGOs in much of the developing world have shifted from education and conscious raising programs focused around structural analysis of power and inequality to technical sort of managerial solutions focused on increasing community self-reliance for poverty alleviation. In other words, there's been this sort of shift from conflict with government to dialogue with government. Empowerment is often no longer connected with the broader aims of social justice, but with helping the poor help themselves become entrepreneurs. In fact, when we look at the World Bank, NGOs are often selected by the World Bank on the condition that they are not explicitly political. This increases funding for those NGOs that are primarily engaged in social service provisions and divert funding from those concerned with social mobilization against privatization, free market reforms, etc. There are a few state CSO models we can look at. The supplementary model suggests that nonprofits provide public goods that the government is unable or unwilling to provide. The complementary model suggests that NGOs are partners with the government, delivering services that are financed by the government. In this sort of relationship, the government often plays a controlling role. There's also an adversarial model, where NGOs force governments to be accountable and push for public policy changes that may not otherwise be implemented. They serve, in other words, as a check on state power. Supplementary models are more common in times of surging prosperity in the private economy and where government is relatively passive, whereas complementary models are more likely in times requiring national unity, the forging of nationhood. Adversarial models are likely to increase in times of social unrest. NGOs in much of the developing world are increasingly performing in supplementary roles as social service providers. But this is not occurring during periods of surging prosperity. On the contrary, it's occurring at a time of deepening poverty and inequality. It is important to ask deeper questions about why exactly states in much of the developing world are relatively passive. What transnational dynamics have contributed to this passivity? Think of Haiti, think of Ecuador. It is also important to query easy formulations about the role of a nation's history and traditions on NGO-government relations. NGOs pluralize the public sphere, thereby increasing opportunities for political representation of the most marginalized, those left behind by traditional political parties, for instance. Because they often work with the poorest of the poor, they deepen and broaden the avenues for citizen participation. Because they cut across ethnic and regional differences, they are seen as capable of breaking down traditional identities imagined to be contrary to liberal democracies. Again, according to the World Bank, an active civil society that encourages greater participation across all sectors of society will aid in decentralization, particularly in those jurisdictions with marked ethnic divisions and deeply rooted local identities. The general trend worldwide, however, has been away from unified and systematic political opposition movements to low politics based on issue-based campaigning and a new openness to the state. More and more NGOs function as service providers, offering training, literacy, and health education programs, which were formerly overseen by the state. In some areas where NGOs have become dominant, independent political action has actually declined, and the numbers of those involved in radical social movements has dropped dramatically. There is a growing emphasis on collaboration rather than competition between the public and private sectors. We do need to query, however, is this focus on collaboration actually masking growing inequalities between those sectors? Moreover, what are the lines between collaboration and co-optation? Is a decline in adversarial relationships between NGOs and governments necessarily positive? That is, does conflict necessarily entail healthier relationships between the two, or is conflict needed? And what about paying attention to the multiple kinds of collaborations with governments in which NGOs are engaged? These are questions we need to ask ourselves when we're looking at CSOs and state passivity. As mentioned, the People's Republic of China generally bucks the trend when it comes to the relationships that society has with the state, whereby there's a more intimate relationship between both sectors. Interestingly enough, the Chinese state has gradually withdrawn from a burgeoning market economy, creating space for a numerical growth of non-governmental organizations. The increase of NGOs has to a great extent mirrored the rising social challenges as a result of economic liberalization in the country. In China, the NGO sector is currently heavily regulated by the central state. Now, we can use the corporatist sort of framework to understand how NGOs and the state actually interact with each other. The corporatist framework does not necessarily define any political system, but rather they are institutional mechanisms in service of government. What we have seen is that in the Chinese context, the state has shifted from relying on tools of coercion to managing society, which I call overt sanctioning, to developing strong ties with social organizations, which I call tacit sanctioning. The local states are the intermediaries between the central state and the local population. In the case of migrant NGOs, for example, by privileging the local state, we can discover different factors that shape the development of NGOs. In the context of China, especially in the 2000s and the 2010s, for most parts of the 2010s that is, the state attempted to control the NGO sector in the form of a dual registration program, whereby the Ministry of Civil Affairs and a sponsoring government department was necessary for an NGO to become officially as such. Now, this burdensome procedure can potentially prevent many NGOs from being registered. What we see, though, is that many NGOs overcome this administrative hurdle by registering as for-profit entities. The relationship between NGOs and the central state is still important, since it is currently the level where regulatory frameworks are centered. The municipal government, however, rewards NGOs for their work, inclusion of any potentially threatening elements into the fold of the government. Local state actors may seek to engage with NGOs under the guise that they can assist the state's effort in promoting harmonious development amongst its constituents. So this might suggest to us in the future there will continue to be a large number of government stakeholders involved in the resolution of social issues. This gives NGOs the potential to increase opportunities to collaborate and cooperate with government agencies at all levels in the nation. As we have discussed, civil society is often employed to understand socio-political change. Whether this is the approach we adopt, it is nonetheless a device to illuminate greater pluralization of society. If state and society are not so easily separable, what might this mean for socio-political change? Social stakeholders may not be the agents of change as we might expect them to be due to their close interrelatedness between state and society. In the end, however, we can suggest there's no single theoretical framework that would adequately explain the social, political, and economic changes that are occurring and the role and relationships NGOs and civil society actors have in this process. In our next lecture, we will look more in greater depth between the government and NGO relationships.